Dustin shocked me because we were shooting a scene.
I'm very sorry about this.
My wine glass was sitting there and he...
You know, she was a brilliant actress, but it was a moment in her life when emotionally...
She could draw on that pain.
Yes.
Really...
Behind an Oscar-winning performance was a moment no one saw coming. Meryl Streep was just beginning her Hollywood journey when she stepped onto the set of Kramer vs. Kramer. But what happened between her and Dustin Hoffman behind the scenes would leave a lasting mark on her performance, her memory, and her boundaries. Why did Hoffman do what he did? How did it shape Streep's emotional delivery in one of her most iconic roles? And how does she feel about it now, decades later? Get ready for a revealing look at a complicated dynamic hidden beneath cinematic brilliance. A stunning first encounter. The tension between Meryl Streep and Dustin Hoffman didn't build over time. It erupted on day one. When Streep stepped onto the set of Kramer vs. Kramer, she wasn't just arriving at a new job, she was walking straight into one of the most unsettling introductions of her career. The moment cameras rolled for their first scene together, Dustin Hoffman slapped her across the face. It wasn't in the script, it wasn't agreed upon, and it certainly wasn't expected. The moment was real, raw, visceral, and captured forever on film. Hoffman, a devout method actor, later justified his actions by claiming he was chasing authenticity. According to him, the emotional intensity of the scene required shock, something unscripted that would provoke a genuine reaction. For him, the line between character and actor blurred, and he believed it was a necessary sacrifice for the sake of the performance. But for Streep, who was already mourning the death of her fiancé, John Cazale, the slap was more than just a creative decision. It was a violation. She didn't lash out or storm off the set. Instead, she absorbed the moment with a quiet, professional resolve that has defined her throughout her career. In interviews years later, she admitted she was shocked. She hadn't been warned, hadn't been consulted, and hadn't given consent for the sudden physicality. Yet she chose to stay in character, chose not to interrupt the take, and chose, in that moment, to protect the performance rather than confront the actor. It was an early lesson in the complicated power dynamics of film sets, a lesson many women in Hollywood have faced for decades. This infamous slap wasn't the only time Hoffman's method blurred the lines of professionalism. In the same production, he reportedly taunted Streep by bringing up Cazale's death in an effort to provoke her tears. While the film's emotional core may have benefited from the realism, it came at the cost of ethical boundaries, and at Streep's expense. Some crew members defended Hoffman's actions as brilliant acting. Others saw it as calculated cruelty disguised as commitment. The line between method and manipulation had never been more controversial. But what's most remarkable is Streep's response. She didn't retaliate in the press or demand the scene be reshot. Instead, she held her ground with a quiet authority that would later become her hallmark. Clear and graceful in her recollection of the incident, she was never really one to vilify Hoffman, but she also never excused anything he did. "This was my first movie, and it was tough, but I knew what mattered was the work," she once stated. Prudently holding back, choosing rather to consider the performance, she went on to establish herself as a serious actress in an industry where women, specifically younger ones, were commonly brushed off. Kramer vs. Kramer went ahead to win 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Hoffman and Best Supporting Actress for Streep. But this scene, that took the audience inside the fire of emotion at the very beginning, became a quiet witness to that power asymmetry on the set. More than 40 years later, that slap is being talked about. Some critics say that Hoffman's method was artistically valid, but one can also say that it was ethically the most horrible thing. Some describe such a move as audacious. Others consider it abusive. Hoffman himself shows some regret for the incident, but it seems the debate has been reignited. Was he pushing the edge of fine art, or was it simply a man controlling what he could get away with? That moment wasn't just jarring, it was captured on film forever, and it still sparks debate today. A method actor gone too far. The making of Kramer vs. Kramer may have earned Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep critical acclaim, but behind the camera, it became a theater of emotional manipulation. Hoffman, already known for his intense approach to acting, crossed lines during production that some crew members would later describe not as passionate performance, but as psychological warfare. The most infamous moment came during the hallway confrontation scene. As the cameras rolled and emotions flared, Hoffman slapped Streep across the face, unscripted and unannounced. Her reaction, raw and startled, was exactly what Hoffman, and perhaps the director, wanted. But was it acting or was it abuse? It didn't end there. Hoffman, still grieving the loss of his longtime friend and Streep's former partner, John Cazale, took a step so personal and cutting it left crew members speechless. Just moments before a take, he leaned in and whispered John Cazale into her ear, a name filled with heartbreak and recent loss. Cazale had died of cancer not long before filming began, and Streep was still navigating her grief. Hoffman weaponized that vulnerability, triggering an emotional collapse right as the cameras rolled. For the viewer, the tears and tremble felt heartbreakingly real. But now we know why. They were. Some justified this behavior. Director Robert Benton and others in the production argued that the emotional realism achieved was integral to the film's success. In their eyes, Hoffman's provocation wasn't cruelty, it was commitment. They argued that the film needed that edge, that rawness, that volatility. But others on set, and certainly many watching from the outside, saw it differently. What Hoffman did wasn't direction. It wasn't collaboration. It was domination. He didn't ask for consent. He didn't trust the process or his scene partner. Instead, he decided to exploit real pain to elevate his performance. The result may have won him an Oscar, but at what cost? Hoffman has long been known for pushing boundaries in the name of method acting. But during the filming of Kramer vs. Kramer, it became a pattern. Streep, then early in her career, repeatedly found herself at the receiving end of emotional provocations, some subtle, others brutal. When challenged about his conduct years later, Hoffman admitted to being difficult and offered vague reflections about the fine line between performance and personal attack. But the stories persisted, and as the industry shifted and conversations around on-set abuse began to take shape, many re-examined his behavior with a more critical lens. The 1970s and early 1980s were, in many ways, a golden age for method acting and a dangerous one. Directors and studios often enabled their stars to go to extreme lengths in pursuit of so-called authenticity. If a performance resonated with audiences and critics, few asked what toll it took to get there. Female actors especially were expected to endure, to absorb, to use their pain in service of the story. The deeper reality is that many weren't given a choice. Meryl Streep, to her credit, rarely spoke publicly about the incident in detail. She once mentioned that her collaboration with Hoffman involved some of the most challenging moments of her early career, but left it at that. Her silence, some believe, was part of the professional armor women often wore in a male-dominated industry. Still, her performance in Kramer vs. Kramer remains one of the most lauded in cinematic history, quietly complex, emotionally devastating, painfully authentic. Now, we know why. But it wasn't just a single moment. This was a pattern that would play out again and again during filming. Glass shards and genuine fear. On the surface, Kramer vs. Kramer was a quiet, devastating domestic drama about divorce, parenting, and emotional survival. But underneath the film's calm exterior were very real, very raw moments that left more than just a mark on the audience. One of the most famous and most disturbing scenes from the movie involved a heated custody argument between the characters played by Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep. It was a crucial moment in the film's emotional arc. But what viewers didn't realize was that the tension on screen wasn't entirely scripted. And what happened in that kitchen left Streep shaken and possibly injured. As the two characters argued over their son and their broken relationship, Hoffman was supposed to express rage, but not in the way he ultimately did. Without warning the crew, the director, or his co-star, Hoffman smashed a wine glass against the wall, sending shards flying across the kitchen and startling everyone, including Streep. The moment was raw. The sound of glass breaking echoed with real panic. And most importantly, the look of fear and shock on Meryl Streep's face? It wasn't acting. That was real. Director Robert Benton kept the take. The camera caught something electric, something unscripted and deeply visceral. It worked on screen, amplifying the scene's emotional weight. But what Streep endured wasn't part of the plan. According to crew accounts, she wasn't told Hoffman would do that. It was a spontaneous, unapproved action that crossed a professional boundary. Streep later said plainly to Hoffman, "Next time you do that, I'd appreciate you letting me know." She wasn't angry as much as she was stunned. Stunned that a scene partner would willingly put her in a vulnerable position for the sake of capturing a real reaction. For Meryl Streep, this wasn't about method acting or film authenticity, it was about respect and safety. At the time, she was still grieving the recent death of her partner, actor John Cazale, and had poured herself into Kramer vs. Kramer as a way to channel that grief. But the set wasn't always a safe place. In fact, it sometimes felt hostile. Hoffman had been known for pushing buttons, and stories from the set suggest he went beyond that, slapping Streep in rehearsal, taunting her off-camera, and even whispering Cazale's name to manipulate her emotional state. The falling down wine glass wasn't just a broken prop. It represented a fracture in the treatment of women on film sets that ran far deeper. In an electrifying culture of shock and submission, actresses were thought to be obliged to take it for the sake of art. Streep had some claim to decency. She didn't speak up then. Calmly, she did make the point that it could be considerate to inform her the next time somebody decided to smash a glass within inches of her face. This was a tiny act of defiance in a business environment that far too often brushed off a woman's discomfort as collateral damage. Despite the tension behind the scenes, Kramer vs. Kramer reached critical and box office acclaim. Streep won her Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for the film, and Hoffman won for Best Actor. But the legacy of the film is a complicated one. It was a hallmark in their two careers, but for Streep, it was at a cost. It was one thing to depict a woman breaking down, standing up, and fighting back, but in real life, she had to do the same herself off-set. And while that take made the final cut, what Streep endured behind it wasn't part of the script. Off-camera reactions and fallout. The simmering tension between Meryl Streep and Dustin Hoffman on the set of Kramer vs. Kramer wasn't just an on-screen dynamic. It was a storm that affected the entire production. While their performances would go on to win Oscars and critical acclaim, the atmosphere behind the camera told a more turbulent story. It wasn't just one uncomfortable slap or a single argument, it was a sustained period of emotional strain, especially for Streep, who was still reeling from the death of her partner, John Cazale, just months before filming began. What few people knew at the time was how much Hoffman's behavior rattled not just Streep, but several other cast members. According to crew members and set insiders, Hoffman's intense approach to method acting sometimes crossed the line. Reports emerged of him pushing boundaries with female co-stars, not just Streep. In fact, one young actress originally cast in a supporting role was allegedly recast after expressing discomfort with Hoffman's aggressive rehearsal style. Though the studio never officially confirmed this change was related to his conduct, those close to the production believed otherwise. His volatility wasn't just a challenge, it was disruptive. Director Robert Benton found himself treading a thin line as a filmmaker. In him was the hope that what he had tried to bring up in terms of the raw energy between the two prima donnas would rub off on the screen in the form of creating better realism. But, of course, Benton also battled this really trying atmosphere on this set in private. A few of the team members have called the scene nothing short of emotionally exhausting. Benton himself would later indicate that he was caught between two different kinds of needs: the creative intensity Hoffman brought to the part, and the emotional authenticity Streep mostly channeled quietly, without confrontation or shock tactics. Balancing those two approaches behind the scenes had constant needs for intervention and diplomacy. Streep, however, did not throw up a public storm. Carrying herself with quiet determination for a newcomer compared to Hoffman, who had a weight of considerable film praise at his back, she absorbed her grief, her frustrations, and her personal convictions through the character of Joanna Kramer, a woman who is misunderstood and judged for walking away. This and the fact that her emotional journey mirrored what Streep herself probably had to go through to form the performance made for gut-wrenching impact. Yet, maintaining that grace under pressure required strength few understood at the time. She later reflected that she often felt isolated, surrounded by men who made the major decisions and rarely consulted her directly. Years later, Streep talked about this experience, mindful of being candid. In 2018, she would acknowledge that Hoffman had crossed the line. He had slapped her, unbidden, in a scene for which she had not given any agreement to do so. That was overstepping, she said simply. Although she did not call herself a victim, it was a quiet act of reclamation. Streep stated that she would not allow the world to rewrite her story or bury it in glory and awards. Meryl Streep's words have renewed meaning as the industry was beginning to reflect on its abuse and hiding at the time of the #MeToo movement. Younger actors started to reread Kramer verses. Kramer, with an understanding of the emotional work women like Streep endured to survive and prosper in an industry shaped for men. Without any allegations against him, Dustin Hoffman saw his reputation reshaped with coming of age of the old stories. With time, the admiration for his art started sharing the same turf, with uncomfortable questions about what it did to others. But the tension wasn't confined to the set. Years later, something else would surface, something even more personal. The allegations. In the haze of Hollywood legends and silver screen chemistry, one moment between Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep remains deeply unsettling. It wasn't during filming or rehearsal, but during their very first meeting, that the alleged line was crossed. In a 1979 Time magazine profile, Hoffman is quoted as saying he groped Streep's breast when they met, supposedly in an effort to shock her into character for their roles in Kramer versus Kramer. It's a claim that, even in the looser culture of the late 1970s, raised eyebrows. According to the article, the gesture wasn't framed as offensive, it was almost tossed off as an anecdote about Hoffman's eccentric acting methods. At the time, method acting was all the rage, and many actors got away with what today would be seen as clear violations of personal boundaries. But decades later, the anecdote resurfaced, and this time in the context of a changing industry. In 2017, as the hashtag #MeToo movement took hold, the quote began circulating again, now met with the shock and anger it always deserved. Streep's publicist pushed back against the Time article, saying the quote was not an accurate rendering of that meeting. However, the statement also acknowledged that there was an offense and Dustin apologized. That admission left many with more questions than answers. What really happened between the two actors during that first encounter? Was the quote entirely fabricated, or simply uncomfortable truth watered down for public relations? It's difficult to say, in part because neither Streep nor Hoffman has spoken at length about that moment. Streep has repeatedly distanced herself from the story, but never denied that something inappropriate occurred. This ambiguity speaks to something deeper: the way Hollywood used to operate. In the pre-hashtag #MeToo era, even the most respected and powerful women in the industry often had to navigate violations quietly. Publicly challenging a male co-star, especially one as revered as Hoffman, meant risking everything. Streep was just emerging in her career when Kramer vs. Kramer began production. To call out Hoffman then might have meant losing the very opportunities that helped build her legacy. And so, while some form of forgiveness may follow, wounds don't vanish with apologies. In a later interview, Streep admitted that while she worked together with Hoffman during early work, there wasn't just a first meeting where the actor. Most notably, she is one incident in which Hoffman slapped her across the face without warning during a scene. Streep said she was shocked and outraged, adding, "This was my first movie. This was my first take in my first movie, and he just slapped me." That boundary crossing left its mark, whether it was the groping or the slap, or the general intensity in which Hoffman approached things, became more and more evident over time as society's conception of consent, professionalism, and respect evolved. Even with time and forgiveness, those early wounds can't be erased. And Hoffman wasn't just accused by Streep. A pattern of behavior emerges. By 2017, the tide was shifting. The entertainment industry was finally being forced to confront its darkest corners as the hashtag #MeToo movement gathered momentum. Powerful names once protected by prestige were suddenly under scrutiny. Among them was Dustin Hoffman. For decades, he had been admired for his transformative roles and deep commitment to the craft of acting. But for a growing number of women, his performances off-screen painted a very different picture. One that was invasive, uncomfortable, and, in some cases, deeply traumatic. It began with a column in The Hollywood Reporter, where Anna Graham Hunter, a former intern on the 1985 TV movie Death of a Salesman, accused Hoffman of routinely making inappropriate, explicit comments and groping her when she was just 17. Her detailed account included diary entries she had written at the time, capturing the confusion and humiliation she felt, but never had the freedom to express back then. "He asked me to give him a foot massage my first day on set," she wrote. "I was a kid, and this was the most powerful person on the project." But Hunter wasn't alone. In the weeks that followed, 6 more women came forward with their own stories. Each account varied slightly in the setting and the context, but they shared unsettling similarities. One woman claimed Hoffman had inserted his fingers inside her while they rehearsed for a Broadway play. Another remembered his hands wandering during a photo shoot. Yet another recalled him repeatedly grabbing her rear while she worked as a production assistant. In every account, the women described a man who crossed physical and verbal boundaries with confidence and without consequence. The allegations spanned years, from the 1970s through the early 2000s, and suggested that Hoffman's alleged misconduct wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment, it was a pattern. What stung many observers was not only the allegations themselves, but the way Hoffman responded. His first public statement was cautious. "I have the utmost respect for women and feel terrible that anything I might have done could have put her in an uncomfortable situation. I am sorry." It was a non-apology, critics said, one that failed to address the specifics and instead leaned on vague regret. He later denied the other allegations outright, stating they were not reflective of who I am. But the damage had already been done. The silence around him for so long, broken only in private whispers, was now out in the open. And once it was, people began to re-examine earlier moments, ones that had previously seemed harmless or were brushed off as typical method actor eccentricities. Interviews where he'd made inappropriate jokes. Public interactions with young actresses that now felt chilling in hindsight. A pattern, long buried beneath applause and awards, had finally surfaced. It threw new light on such early Meryl Streep statements in the 1970s. Though she hadn't spoken publicly about those experiences for decades, her story of being physically overpowered during a rehearsal now sounded not like an isolated incident, but more like the first page of a longer, much darker narrative. Her silence, whether intentional or not, replicated that of so many other manner in the industry, young performers caught between ambition, fear, and survival in a system in which the odds rarely favored them. The revelations shook not only Hoffman as a figure, but also the trust of many of his fans, who had respected him based on his performances. And it created an eerie shadow over the silence-encouraging establishments. Once honored for his emotional openness on screen, Hoffman was now being interrogated about what more had been lurking under that very same intensity. And those who had worked beside him, cheered for him, now had to reconcile what they knew, or thought they knew, with what was finally being said. Meryl had long moved on, but when the world finally started paying attention, her early story gained new weight. Forgiveness, legacy, and moving forward. In the years that followed the controversy surrounding her early experience with Dustin Hoffman, Meryl Streep continued to rise, gracefully, powerfully, and with a kind of quiet resolve that didn't demand the spotlight, but commanded it nonetheless. For decades, she remained mostly private about the discomfort she felt during those early interactions. But eventually, time brought a shift, not in denial or erasure, but in reflection. In a later interview, when asked again about Hoffman, Streep responded with something few expected. "I really, really love him. All is forgiven." Those 5 words carried the weight of decades, not just of Hollywood history, but of personal growth, pain, and complexity. They didn't erase what had happened, nor did they suggest it should be forgotten. Instead, they reflected a deeper truth about forgiveness, not as approval, but as release. Her statement wasn't a sweeping absolution, nor a plea for public reconciliation. It was simply her choice to let go, to stop carrying someone else's shame on her back. She made it clear in other interviews that she didn't excuse inappropriate behavior, but she also wasn't interested in becoming the permanent face of confrontation. "I think I spoke clearly," she once said. And indeed, she did. What's striking about Streep's stance is its nuance. In an age of absolutes, she dared to speak with complexity. She acknowledged Hoffman's brilliance, describing him as one of the most gifted actors I've ever worked with. She credited his intensity for elevating their on-screen dynamic in Kramer versus Kramer, even while clearly delineating the off-screen discomfort. This ability to hold both truths at once is rare, especially under the glare of public judgment. It's what makes her story not just relevant, but necessary. Because forgiveness in her case isn't submission. It's power reclaimed. The incident, and the grace with which she carried it, left a deeper imprint than the headlines ever could. Her experience, along with others like it, shaped her voice in the industry, not as someone seeking vengeance, but as someone demanding respect. Over time, she became far more than just a gifted actress. She became a presence, a standard. The woman who could hold her own against Hollywood giants, not just in talent, but in dignity. In press rooms, on red carpets, and especially on stage, Streep's gravitas only grew. She refused to be tokenized, but she also never apologized for her intelligence or her poise. For younger women coming into the industry, whether they aspired to act, direct, write, or simply be heard, she became a symbol of what it looked like to carry wounds without being defined by them. She didn't need to turn her story into a movement. Just by telling it once, with honesty, she gave it weight. And then she moved forward. In a world hungry for outrage, Streep offered something subtler, but no less powerful: clarity. She reminded us that pain doesn't always need to be screamed to be heard, and that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes, it's waiting for the right moment to speak. And yet, beneath all the awards, the iconic roles, and the accolades, her humanity has never slipped. In candid moments, she's joked about her early failures, her insecurities, even the imposter syndrome that still haunts her at times. That's the real Meryl, a woman of depth, grace, and quiet fire. She never asked to become a voice in these conversations, but when history called, she answered, not with anger, but with integrity. Behind her calm strength is a story of discomfort, confrontation, and quiet courage. A story she never asked to tell, but one we can't ignore. In the end, Meryl Streep's journey isn't just about one uncomfortable moment. It's about the legacy she forged despite it. Her choice to speak, to forgive, and to evolve on her own terms redefined what resilience could look like in an industry that rarely makes space for it. She never framed herself as a victim, nor did she shy away from truth. Instead, she walked forward with the kind of grace that doesn't shout, but lingers. That's the legacy she leaves, not just in film, but in the quiet revolution of choosing dignity over spectacle. Survivors like Prentice weren't alone in reporting strange noises that didn't align with a simple iceberg strike. His haunting words, spoken nearly 7 decades later, suggest that something deeper, darker, and possibly hidden from the public may have been at play that night. Other crew members recalled odd vibrations and metallic echoes reverberating through the ship's hull. Even after all these years, their testimonies fuel speculation that the full truth behind the disaster was never fully revealed. If you were surprised by what Meryl endured to deliver one of her most unforgettable performances, drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Hollywood has truly changed? Make sure to like, subscribe, and watch the next video on screen for more untold stories behind legendary performances.